Hello everybody, my name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and welcome back to CNF Talks, a series of interviews that we conduct with speakers at our forthcoming events. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Benjamin Franta, who's the founding head of the Climate Litigation Lab and Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Sustainable Law Programme at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. And Benjamin is going to be joining us in person at the Climate and ESG Legal Risk Management Summit to be held in London on the 25th of March. Benjamin, welcome.
Thank you so much, Morris. Glad to be here.
Good to have you with us. So let's turn to our first question, if we may. What do you see as the major growth areas or drivers, if you like, in climate and ESG litigation?
Yes, we're seeing a lot of growth in different kinds of litigation today. Some of the main categories of litigation are the climate damages litigation, and we see that as a major force in the US. We see cities and states seeking potentially hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars in climate adaptation costs and climate damages costs, mostly from fossil fuel producers. Although the scope of that liability might expand over time. And we also see growing greenwashing litigation, mostly consumer protection actions, but these implicate not just the fossil fuel producers, but also the creative and advertising firms that participate in that advertising. And of course, outside the US, we're seeing lots of climate litigation in Europe and other parts of the world. We're seeing these lawsuits that are seeking injunctions based on the Paris Climate Agreement. Those have huge implications for all businesses, essentially. And we see banks targeted by those. We see automobile companies, manufacturers targeted by those. And then finally, I think the last thing to add is just that we're seeing the international courts starting to get involved in climate issues and defining what are human rights in the context of climate change, and that's going to influence climate legal action all over the world for decades going forward. So there's a lot happening.
So I'm presuming that that's just set to grow and grow. Do you think that litigation will actually be an effective tool, as it were, in driving decarbonation in governments and across the business community?
Well, I think it will be one of the main drivers of that transformation. I think it will work synergistically and in a catalytic way with public policy and legislation. We've seen there have been public policy efforts around climate change for over 30 years now. And they've been, heroic in some sense, but insufficient so far. And so this litigation trend could create the leverage needed to actuate that legislative effort and get things moving. I mean, it's no secret that one of the main reasons legislation has failed around the world is the lobbying power and the political power of the incumbent, who don't want things to change for obvious reasons. And litigation is starting to change that power dynamic and that calculus. So I think that is a really important factor going forward, along with the direct policy effects of some of the lawsuits, like some of the Paris injunction suits, and now we're even in the U.S. some legislative bills that seek to create climate adaptation super funds. So these would actually be kind of like a victim compensation fund, but for climate change, where, say, a state would just directly take those resources, that money from the fossil fuel producers, and that's another way of getting at the same remedy that some of the litigation is seeking. So I think we're just going to see a lot of litigation shaking up the public policy scene and the climate scene in general.
Yeah, so it's going to be a real driver, isn't it? Do you think it's going to have quite an impact on investment decisions by companies? I guess it will. If people are running scared of potential litigation, more so perhaps than they might have been of regulation, do you think that's going to drive investment decisions by corporates?
Well, I think it very well could, and I think it probably should. We don't know the outcome of much of this litigation yet. We'll know a lot more in a year. We'll know even more in 5 years.
Yeah.
But we know there will probably be more and more of this litigation as climate damages grow, as there's more and more evidence of inaction and even malfeasance by some of the corporates. And I'm thinking of the fossil fuel producers, the carbon majors on this. So we'll likely see more of the litigation. And what this means is that investors in those sectors may be exposed directly or indirectly to liability risk or risk of devaluation of their investments. And so that's something to have on the radar. And it's a material risk. And some of my colleagues here at Oxford just published a paper in Science discussing how the legal risks are material for lots of different corporates and different sectors, and how that really should be quantified and disclosed going forward. And then the last really interesting part is we're starting to see investment in litigation. So we're seeing commercial investment in litigation financing now in the climate space, because some of that is monetizable. So we're seeing both sides of the coin in terms of moving investors around litigation.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in London, we've seen a growth in litigation funding. And obviously that there's the European movement to have class actions in this space, which I think will also drive the whole movement and probably increase the effectiveness of such litigation. But if you're a company and you're thinking about, well, how do I best steer away from these dangers? Are there any ways they might mitigate the risk of litigation and activism? I suppose most obviously it's not to invest in things where there's likely to be a problem and to attract litigation. But what would your advice be?
Well, I think there are a few basic pieces of advice. The most exposed sector to litigation is the fossil fuel sector.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of, clear by now. And so, investments in that sector are, I would say, in my personal opinion, they're at risk because of this litigation. So something to keep in mind. But when it comes to greenwashing, which is maybe a broader issue that is most directly relevant to more and more companies, whether they're a bank or whether they're an airline or whatever, it's really important that the branding and the advertising around that is not just narrowly true, but is not misleading, is sort of honest as a whole. And so we see a lot of public facing brand advertising in particular today that portrays a company as sustainable when that might not really be the case. That exposes those companies to that sort of litigation risk. So that's something that all sectors should be aware of.
And particularly in financial services, where you have these taxonomies at both the European and the UK level about what can and cannot be said if you're going to put a sustainable label on a financial product. I think financial institutions are quite worried by that. Just finally, Benjamin, are there any particular trends in climate litigation activism that specific ones more than the general ones that companies and financial institutions should be aware of?
Well, I think we're going to see more damages litigation. That's going to be driven by advances in scientific research that allow climate damages to be quantified and then attributed to specific emitters. And so I think we're going to see more of that all over the world. Of course, the US is probably the kind of epicenter of big, tort damage litigation, but I think we're going to see that spread all over the world. I think that's one of the biggest trends that we're going to see. And so I think we're also going to see some market disruption, coming from renewables more generally as they continue to drop in cost. And so, in a sense, if we think historically, let's look back to the tobacco litigation in the 1990s. Some observers have, noted that the tobacco industry already had some factors stacked against it, and the litigation was one of the things that accelerated the decline, at least in the US for a while, of that industry and and things like that. But so we see climate litigation, especially against the fossil fuel sector and related sectors, as something that will probably accelerate the replacement of fossil fuels by renewables and these broader trends in regulation and public policy and so on.
Yeah, very, very interesting. It really is watch this space, isn't it? There's going to be quite a growth in this area. Well, we've run out of time, sadly. I'd just like to remind our viewers that if they'd like to hear more on this and on related issues, please do attend in person our summit on climate and ESG legal risk management on the 25th of March in London. Benjamin, thank you very much for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thank you.